love is a burning thing, and it makes a fiery ring. Bound by wild desire, I fell into a ring of fire. I fell into a burning ring of fire. I went down, 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 and the flames went higher. And it burns, 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 the ring of fire, the ring.
So welcome to the Naturalist Nights here at the 3rd Street Center. The Naturalist Nights are co-sponsored by the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies and the Wilderness Workshop and the Roaring Fork Audubon. And my name is Sarah Johnson, and I represent the Wilderness Workshop. As many of you know, it's great to see you week after week, and for those who haven't been here week after week, it's welcome. And as you know, these happen on Wednesday nights here at 5:30 and in Aspen at ACES at 7 o'clock on Thursdays. However, we only have 2 more weeks of these wonderful talks, and the last one on the week of March 7th is actually going to be on Tuesday in Aspen, Wednesday in Carbondale, and then Thursday night will be the Wild and Scenic Film Festival at the Wheeler Opera House. So that week is a little bit different. But we will still be here on Wednesday night at the same time. So as you know, the Naturalist Night series is sponsored by many generous sponsors. Thank you to each of them. If any of you are in the room, thank you very much for your support in this great program. And tonight, our special sponsor is the Gantt, who is actually hosting our speaker this evening and has hosted 2 other speakers this year. So it's quite a generous donation from them. Also, GrassRoots TV records these shows each week and makes them possible for you to view on our websites, as well as they put it on their station throughout the week. So maybe you've seen some of the last few shows on that station, which is Channel 12 and Channel 82, depending on where you are. So every week we do pass around the clipboard. If you didn't sign it when you came in, please do sign it. And also, as always, new this year, but as always this year, the clipboard for continuing education certificates is over here by the piano. And I mentioned this before, but Roaring Fork School District has pre-approved the Naturalist Night series for educators for license to help teachers with their teaching license renewal. So that's a pretty cool relationship. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, next week we'll have a local resident, Kendall Backich, who lives down valley in Newcastle, but she's a fish biologist with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And she'll be talking about her work with cutthroat trout, and the title of her talk is Cutthroat Trout, Conservation Through Uncertainty. She's a great speaker and is from right here in our own valley. So make sure you come back and check that out before the final talk in 2 weeks. But tonight we have another Sarah. And as you know, 2 weeks ago we had 2 Sarahs. Tonight we have me and this Sarah, so it's a good thing. So Dr. Sarah McCaffrey has come over from Fort Collins and has only been in Fort Collins for not that long, a couple months, and before that was in Chicago for a long time. So we're grateful that she's able to move to Colorado and then come here. She is a research forester for the U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service at the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Fort Collins. Her research focuses on the social aspects of fire management. This work has included projects examining social acceptability of prescribed fire and thinning, and incentives for creation and maintenance of defensible space. She has also initiated work examining social issues that occur during and after fires, including evacuation decision-making and agency community interaction during fires. She received her PhD at the Wildland Resource Science. She received her PhD in Wildland Resource Science in 2002 from the University of California at Berkeley. And her research is extremely pertinent to where we live here in the Roaring Fork Valley. 75% of our valley, our watershed, is public land, and many of us live within such close proximity to wildland, and that wildland interface, whether you're in Aspen or down in Iron Bridge or anywhere in between, this is a very pertinent subject. So we're thrilled that she's able to be here. And without further ado, Dr. Sarah McCaffrey.
how do I? Details. So for me, I actually grew up in Boulder, so it's coming home to be back in Colorado, and I'm really happy to be back in Colorado. And you know, when they said, "And as soon as you're back, you want to go to Aspen?" I was like, "Yeah, that sounds good." Not a problem. So I've been looking at social issues around fire management for almost 20 years now. A lot of this talk that I am giving is, I generally actually give this to managers within the fire community. So it's really exciting to have the public, because I'm going to be talking about you. So you can tell me at the end if I'm right or wrong. And the key message that I have when I talk to managers is beware the imagined public. There are a lot of stories and narratives about what you guys think and why you think it and why you behave the way you do. And the reality is that none of those narratives hold up when you actually look at the empirical data. And it's been really interesting to me because, I mean, the first narrative I ever heard was Smokey Bears taught the public to think all fire is bad. And I bought it. And then one of my professors, when I was doing my dissertation, said, "Where's your evidence?" So I learned very quickly to always question these narratives. And over time, I've learned that they really don't hold up. But they still stick. I will still hear at meetings, Smokey's taught the public to think all fire is bad. And I couldn't figure out what's going on. You know, the data doesn't support it. Why does the narrative stick? And I think there's two reasons why they stick. One is sampling bias. So people who are upset with something are more likely to come and tell you they're upset with something. And so those are more likely to be the people who don't like fire, don't like what you're doing. And so managers extrapolate that to equal everybody, the public. So they basically take a non-representative sample to equal the entire public. And so they're not necessarily making judgments based on a good sample. And the other one is confirmation bias. And this is something that we all do. And it's basically, once we've formed an opinion about something, we tend to give more credence to information that supports that opinion, and we tend to discount something that contradicts it. So basically, if you form an opinion about what the problem is or what the group belief is or where it's coming from, you will pay attention to things that support that view, and you probably won't even see the ones that don't support the view. So for instance, one of the ones I'll talk about in a minute is we often think it's the new people moving into the area who don't have defensible space. And the evidence doesn't support that actually. But if you run into, and this is actually more an example of sampling bias, if you run into a homeowner who's going, "I don't get it, we don't have fire here," and they're new, you pay attention to them. But if you run into somebody who's been there for 30 years and they say, "I don't get it, we don't have fire," you just don't hear it. So that's part of what's going on. So what I'm talking about is from research from a lot of studies, and not just studies that I was involved in. There's been over 60 studies looking at social issues of fire management since 2000. Most of these are looking at how people think and respond to fire before a fire ever happens. So the dynamics that I'm talking about are pretty consistent across the studies. And I'll talk about where there's variation and when there's not variation. But I'm going to start by talking about some of the narratives that I often hear. So this is one. People don't get the fire risk. If they understood that they lived in an area where there's a high fire risk, they would do something. So since they're not doing something, they must not understand that the fire risk is really high. Well, does anybody here think you don't live in an area with a high fire risk? Yeah, people get it. People know they live in a high fire risk. The fallacy is in the argument that seeing the risk is going to make you change your behavior. And part of that is that risk is actually this really complex and subjective concept. It's a social construction. And so how we define risk is going to shape how we respond to it and what we're thinking about. So the classic definition of risk is probability times consequences. Now, how I calculate probability is, one, humans are really bad at calculating probability. Two, it's going to depend on the spatial extent you're talking about and the time frame you're talking about. So the probability of a fire in the next 2 minutes is very low. The probability of a fire this coming summer is very high. So that starts changing the type of risk that you're getting. And then the type of consequence you're thinking about is also going to change the risk that you're thinking about. So one of the places where we often run into a conflict between managers' view of risk and the public's view of risk is that managers are generally thinking something along the lines of, what are the odds I'll be on a fire this summer where there are houses that are threatened by a fire? Well, that's a very high risk. The odds that there's going to be a house that burns down from a fire that they're on are pretty good. The homeowner's thinking, what are the odds that my house is going to burn down this summer to a fire? Which is actually pretty infinitesimal. If you actually calculate the odds of the number of houses exposed and the number we actually lose, it's very small. So you might both be talking about fire risk, but you're actually talking about a very different risk. So what it means is that you do have to have high risk perception. You have to see the risk to say, maybe we should do something, but that's not going to be sufficient. And even if you agree on the risk, two individuals might respond very differently to the exact same risk. So it's also about individual variability and those sorts of things. Things that will influence how you respond are risk attitude. So that's a personality trait. Some of us are really risk averse. Some of us think it's really great fun to jump off tall buildings with a parachute. So that all shapes how you respond to something. So we have evidence that people who are very risk averse just choose not to live out where there's a big fire risk. They say, it's not worth it to me. People who are comfortable with the risk say, yeah, that's all right with me. We also have evidence that when people choose to evacuate, people who are really risk tolerant, they tend to stay and defend their home, or they're more likely to stay and defend their home. People who are financially risk tolerant are more likely to evacuate early. So there's also different types of risk tolerance that we have. Trade-offs with the benefits. So we all make these risk calculations in our daily life, and for some people living out in the woods where it's beautiful, you guys have a lot of really good reasons to live here, that is worth that exposure to the risk. And so you're making a calculation, a risk calculation and a trade-off. The sort of more common example I give is, actually probably driving here was a bigger risk to you than any risk you have from fire. Yet it was worth it for you to get in a car because you can get here much more quickly and conveniently. Then individual capacity. Somebody may just not have the time or the physical ability or the finances to actually respond appropriately. Smokey. This is kind of the oldest one. He's taught the public to think all fire is bad. So here's my informal survey. Did he teach you that? Yeah? No. Yes? Yes, he did. Okay. No? Who said no, and what did he teach you?
I would say no, and I felt like he taught me just to be careful when you're outside.
Okay.
Yeah.
But for others, it felt like he taught you that fire is bad. Do you still believe that? No, you're right.
I can still sing the song though.
Let's hear it. And by the way, it is Smokey Bear. It's not Smokey the Bear, but the was added because of the alliteration in the song. So there might have been a point where that was the only message going out where it was more likely that people would believe that all fire was bad. But currently there's very good evidence that people understand that fire has multiple roles and that in many ecosystems it actually is a necessary part of that landscape. And that's really clear from studies that we've done in a number of places. So they understand that it's not quite as simple as just bad. And then we also find that 80% of people generally see prescribed fire as an acceptable management tool. So that also says that they recognize that fire has different roles in different conditions. And that's amazingly consistent across surveys in Wisconsin, Florida, California. And when it breaks down, it's usually about 30% say, yes, absolutely, go for it. And 50% are kind of like, well, it kind of depends on where you're doing it or who's doing it or why you're doing it. And the one thing that does come out is that there's a very clear preference for active forest management. So if there's an option there of prescribed fire and thinning, and do nothing is always the least preferred option across surveys. This is probably the main one I hear now. People don't take responsibility. How do we get those homeowners to take responsibility for their property? And what I see in the studies is there's actually this very strong sense of shared responsibility. We chose to live here. This is our property. It's our responsibility to mitigate the risk on our property. And in surveys, there's evidence that people take that responsibility seriously, as generally at least 2/3, and in some places 80 to 90% of respondents have done some mitigation on their property for fire. But people recognize the risk is shared. So they say, yes, it's my responsibility to manage my land, but everybody else also has to manage their land because that affects my risk. And in general, when they're talking about those other people, you're talking about the federal agencies, talking about the Forest Service, talking about the Bureau of Land Management. It's all fine for you to come and tell me that my land needs to be managed for fire, but you need to be managing your land for fire. It says it's not the Forest Service's responsibility to make sure we are safe from fire, but once they cut down, they need to follow through on that work. We chose to be here, so we need to protect ourselves. So there's a very strong sense of this shared responsibility that we all have a role to play. What do folks expect of government agencies? Well, that they take care of their land. Education, but it's not a general education, it's very specific. People do understand there's a fire risk. They do understand there's things that can be done. But let's get some specifics about, for our area, where's the fire likely to come from? What's the likely fire behavior going to be? What conditions should I be paying particular attention to? For my piece of property, should I be maybe mitigating a bit differently, maybe doing some things more in the direction the fire is more likely to come from? So it's a much more specific information needs that people want. And in some places, help with larger scale obstacles, and that's generally disposing of vegetation. And that's generally in places where either the vegetation grows back very quickly or the landscape is really steep, so it's actually not very easy for people to remove the vegetation themselves, or where people are older and just physically have a hard time getting rid of the vegetation themselves. Then there's a whole bunch of demographic narratives about which groups are the problem. It's really interesting how everybody displaces the problem onto another group. So managers tend to blame the new people. It's all the new people moving into the neighborhood who they come from a place that doesn't have fire, they don't understand fire. Well, the reality is there's no evidence that they're less likely to understand fire or that they're less likely to do something. In fact, I would argue the evidence is a little stronger that they're more likely to do something than longer term residents. Why? Well, two things. One, 60% of moves within the United States are within the same county. So that person is new to the neighborhood, new to the street, he's not new to the fire risk. 20% are within the state, 10% are from out of state, and something like 7% are international moves. So what that says is most new people are very familiar with the fire risk, maybe not to that neighborhood, but they know the fire risk for the area. And the other one is confirmation bias. So if you've lived in a place for a long time, you've probably formed an opinion about how the landscape in that area should be managed and what the issues are. And so when you suddenly get a brochure saying, hey, fire is a big problem, we should do something, people probably aren't going to pay attention to that because it's just not relevant to them. They're going to discount it. People who are new know they're new, sort of seek out information, or if they get information, they're like, oh, hey, maybe I should read this. So they're actually more receptive to information than longer term residents. Part-time. So the new people I talk to tend to blame the part-time residents. This is this chain of blame that happens. And there's no evidence that part-time residents are less likely to understand the fire risk. The evidence on whether they're less likely to mitigate is very mixed. Quite a number of studies find no difference. Some studies find that I think one finds they're more likely to mitigate, and then a few more find that they're less likely to mitigate. But it's not a knowledge issue, it's simply a time constraint. I'm here on the weekends, I'm here for a month in the summer, I don't want to deal with smoke from a prescribed burn. So it's not a knowledge issue, it's just a time issue. And to just continue my chain, the part-time residents say, no, it's not, we're fine, it's the tourists who are the problem. So that's the chain that I run into of displacement of responsibility. This is one that is very common, that if people just experience a fire, well, then they'll really get it and they'll get proactive. There's lots of research that's gone back to the 1950s on natural hazards that shows that experiencing a disaster really doesn't change behavior in any consistent way. Shocking. So for some people, it is this moment it is the aha moment. Oh my God, I should do something. For another contingent of people, it's actually the exact opposite, fatalism. There's nothing I can do that's going to make a difference. That fire jumped an 8-lane freeway. There's no point in mitigating because it's not going to matter. The majority of people actually, it doesn't really change their behavior at all. What an event does is it makes the topic more salient to people for about 3 to 6 months, depending on what else is going on in the world. So as one psychologist told me, humans have a finite pool of worries. We can only worry about so many things at any given time. And usually there's a lot of other more immediate things to worry about than fire. So we tend to, but once you have a fire, suddenly fire is in your pool of worries. Maybe I should pay attention to it. Maybe there's things I can do. But over 3 to 6 months, all those other worries, getting your kids, how are we going to finance college? What are we going to do for retirement? When am I going to retire? Those types of things take place, and fire gets bumped back down the list of things that are going to be on your priority list of worries. So it does give you an opportunity to sort of get people to pay a little bit more attention. The evidence also shows people will pay more attention and are more likely to actually get proactive if you've been talking about it long before. So it's more of a, oh, this is what they were talking about moment. And there's also no evidence that basic demographic characteristics. There's often this desire amongst scientists and managers to be able to say, oh, well, this group of people are really well educated, so they're going to think this way. Or this group of people, they really don't have a lot of money, so they're probably not going to be able to mitigate. And there really isn't any evidence that shows that there's very consistent demographics to explain why people respond the way they do. And there's also this sort of belief that, oh, well, it's different in the West, or it's different in the Southeast, or it's different in the Midwest. All the patterns that I just talked about, there's studies that have been done in all the places, and they are consistent across the places. So there's no evidence that those regional differences really inform things. It's really much more about specific local context. So more specific local context in terms of the topography, in terms of the local ecosystem, in terms of fire history, in terms of what kind of relationship the community has with the local land management agencies. Those all might shift the dynamics I'm talking about to the more positive or the more negative, but it's really a local context issue that informs it. All right, so I've sort of said all these narratives don't hold up. What actually does make people pay attention? Knowledge. This is not surprising. So more people understand the practice, whether it's defensible space, prescribed fire, thinning, tend to have higher acceptance. But what tends to be more important to people than the fire risk are the ecological benefits of a practice. This makes a great deal of sense to me. I imagine you all live here because you think it's beautiful and you love nature and you want nature to be in good shape, and it's a positive thing to think about. Fire, not so positive. It may or may never happen to you. So it actually makes sense that the ecological benefits of a practice are much more influential. And it can affect the concerns about negative outcomes. So prescribed fire, concern about escape, concern about smoke, those are very meaningful in why people don't accept prescribed fire. But as people learn more about the ecological benefits of prescribed fire, those concerns tend to decrease. My favorite quote from, I think, any study is from focus groups they did in Washington State. And they had actually recruited people who belonged to sort of an anti-smoke group. And the reality with smoke is it's really an issue for health reasons. A third of households in the United States have somebody in it who has a health issue that will be affected by smoke. That's a pretty big chunk of people. And smoke means it's going to be incredibly salient to those people. So this was a group mostly of people who, I think, parents with kids with asthma. Not surprising that they would form a group anti-smoke. They were mostly about agricultural burning smoke, but prescribed burning smoke was part of the discussion. And one of the guys said, the more I'm learning about the ecological benefits of doing prescribed fires in the forest, the more I'm really thinking they're okay, and the more I'm thinking the smoke's okay. That's really pissing me off. It's like, I don't want to like it because it affects me, but I also care about the reasons why you're doing it. And then whether or not local knowledge and the context are taken into account can also influence acceptance. And that's just, recognition that they're doing it, they understand the conditions in the area, they understand what our concerns are and what the issues are, and that also influences acceptance. Trust. Do we trust the people who are giving us this information? Do we trust the people who are implementing the project? Trust in an agency does matter, but what turns out to be much, much more important is trust in the people who are actually implementing the prescribed fire or are actually giving you the information. And that's just a competency credibility thing. You want to know that they know what they're doing, that they know how to do it, and that you can trust what they're doing it right. And I tend to reframe this for managers as how I hear people talk about it, which is about respect, which is, we live here, we really care about this landscape we live in. We understand what you're trying to do, and we really expect your expertise as a fire manager. We're not trying to tell you how to do your job, but we want to know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and we want to know that you understand our concerns and you're taking them into account. And I'm willing to give you the respect for your expertise if you're willing to give me respect for what I care about and that I'm being heard. So the other one is interactive communication. So when there's lots of research in social marketing, which I'll talk about in a minute, how do you get people to stop smoking, wear seatbelts, et cetera? You can imagine there's a lot of research on that. And basically, if you want to change that type of behavior, interactive communication is how you change it. It's talking to people, having conversations. And that's because basically for complex topics, it allows people to ask questions, it increases understanding, they can clarify misperceptions, and that can go both ways. So the information provider can clarify that, oh no, they actually understand this, but this is the issue that they're concerned about and they need more information on. So it allows the sort of misperceptions on both sides to be addressed. And it helps build trust. People can get to meet the other person, understand what they're coming from, what they know, what they don't know, that they really do care. Transparency is a heuristic for trust. And a heuristic just basically means a rule of thumb. It's a quick way we make a decision. So a guideline, if this person is being transparent, if you don't have time to build that relationship, they're giving me the straight scoop, they're telling me what they really think, I think I can trust what they're telling me. For fire, interactive exchange is preferred. Most consistent characteristic in determining whether an information source is seen as trusted and useful. There's a clear preference for one-on-one consultations, and that kind of goes to that specific information that we want for our property. And from local sources, again, local sources are going to understand our area and our concerns. No single information source is uniformly best. There's this great desire to find that single piece of information and the single word that will make everybody understand. And the reality is we all respond to information differently, and different sources and different pieces, different language. And for fire, government information sources are generally the preferred and often, but not always, highly rated. The Forest Service actually usually comes out pretty good for fire information. State fire agencies, it really depends on the state. The local fire department tends to be the highest rated consistently, no matter where you go. So this is kind of a model for how to think about sort of what shapes acceptance. We tend to sort of think about it this way. They get the level of the risk, that'll shape acceptance. Well, it's necessary. Oops, going wrong, backwards. More important is knowledge. Do they understand the ecological benefits? Do they understand risk reduction? There's some evidence that a sense of cost effectiveness is influential. Concerns can inform acceptance, but they can modify it with knowledge. And it's also useful to notice that prescribed fire and smoke, those are consistently a negative on acceptance. But a lot of the other ones that we talk about as being concerns about a practice, such as its impact on wildlife, impact on aesthetics, as often as not, the studies show that it's the reason someone might support a practice as a reason why they don't support it. So it improves wildlife habitat for something I care about. It actually looks better after a year or two. Trust, are these people credible? Are they competent? Do they know what they're doing? And the communication process informs both knowledge and trust. So since that 2010, we've done a synthesis of research since then to sort of see what have we learned since. And what was interesting is up to 2010, most of the research had been done in the United States and mostly focusing on these pre-fire issues of defensible space and thinning. Since then, about half the studies now come from outside the United States, and it has shifted largely to also looking at the during and after fire dynamics. And one of the main reasons for that shift is that there's been a lot of research coming out of Australia. And they're very interested in the during fire dynamics because one is in 2009, they had this really big event where they lost 3,000 houses and 173 people. And they're trying to understand what happened. And the other is that they have a policy where they do not automatically evacuate everybody. Legally in most states there, they can't. So they basically tell people, by the way, legally in the US they can't either, except for in Texas. So they have a policy of prepare and then either stay and defend your property or leave early. The worst thing you can do is try to leave at the last minute. That's when you're most likely to be injured. So they've done a lot of research to try to understand if that policy is the reason they lost people. And actually the conclusion is the policy they didn't change their policy, and there's a number of people who would argue that they would have lost a lot more without that policy. But what's really interesting when you start getting this research from other places and other times is you see that these dynamics I've been talking about hold up across countries and across the temporal frame. So similar findings in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, about the importance of trust and social interactions, about benefits of outreach programs, the stories, the different stories people tell about fire management and what's good and what's bad about fire management. It's really interesting to see how identical they are, whether you're in Spain or Australia or the United States. Where we do see differences, they're more about the institutional structure and policies. So Australia, for instance, has no federal firefighting organizations. They're all state-based. And they're mostly almost all volunteer firefighters. So that leads to different outcomes and different conversations than we have here. And the same dynamics are relevant whether you're talking before, during, or after a fire. And they influence one. So if you have an event during a fire that causes discontent with how a fire is managed, that's going to affect trust after the fire and before the next one. There's a lot more work about outreach programs, sort of showing that they can help build community capacity, strengthen social networks, increase information sharing mitigation, and that programs that connect fire agency staff with the community are particularly helpful. That really helps in that information exchange and helping people understand each other. And no single program is effective in all locations. There's no magic program that's going to work. It really has to be tailored to the local context and local needs. The social interactions, the research is really highlighting much more how important those are. They really do build that capacity. And a study in Australia gave, I think, the best description of that process. So basically, they found that the program builds social networks in the community, led development of shared goals and a sense of community. And then that sense of community felt people to have this sense of shared responsibility and that I need to do my part. And so that gave them motivation to prepare and to mitigate on their property. And so they concluded that facilitating the social network building in a community is the best way to increase preparedness. Now, one of the things to note is these networks and interactions, we often tend to think of them, at least in the fire community, they tend to think of them as neighborhoods. And the reality is they can be focused in a neighborhood or they can be very diffuse. I'm sure all of you know people in the rural West who have moved to a rural area to expressly not deal with their neighbors. To not talk to people. That doesn't mean that they don't actually interact and have a social network. Most of those areas where people are there to sort of live on their own, they do have a sense of support when there's an emergency, that they will help each other out when they need help. But otherwise, a good neighbor is somebody who leaves me alone unless I need help. And so they actually do have networks, but they're much more diffuse. Place attachment is important. I think we too often underestimate how much people are tied to where they live. When people rebuild their homes, I'm not in the least surprised that they do that. People live where they do for reasons, and we need to take that into account when we develop programs and develop efforts to change things. And so that informs whether or not local context and knowledge are taken into account can really influence how people interpret and respond to fire management efforts. Probably one of the most consistent findings I've seen, and again, I can think of studies in New Zealand, Canada, US, where when the fire management team came in and did not adequately was not seen to use local knowledge or local resources and how it responded to the fire, that tended to make people think the fire was managed very poorly. And so if you're not really taking into that local account and resources are used, people are not going to be thrilled with how we manage our fires. And that in turn affects those agency community interactions down the road. It also influences how people interpret and act on information. So if you see information that had a picture of Southern California, you probably would not pay attention to that brochure. So it's basically, again, another quick heuristic for this is relevant to me. And so outreach programs that take that local context into account are going to be more successful. They're more likely to engage those part-time residents because they will identify the key people who know the part-time residents and get them involved. They're more likely to identify what the specific local barrier is. Sometimes it's something that nobody would ever expect. And I'll very quickly sort of tell you what we know about fire-wise behaviors. So this is from a survey we did in Ventura County, California, Alachua County, Florida, which is around Gainesville, and around Helena, Montana. So we asked people, to what extent have you managed your vegetation to prepare for a wildfire? So what you see is roughly 80% have done either a great deal or somewhat. And those numbers are very consistent with surveys from other studies. Now you also see that Alachua County is lower, Ventura County really high. They actually have a vegetation ordinance that they enforce. So it's not shocking that 2% say little or none has been done because basically they make them do it.
What state is Alachua County?
Alachua is Florida. And that was an area where it was a little bit more urban and they hadn't done quite so much outreach about fire stuff yet. And we also asked people, so how important were these various factors in why you managed your vegetation? So most important was how effective it could be. And this has been shown with a lot of other natural hazard studies that the effectiveness of an action really is associated with how much people are going to do something. The level of risk matters, knowing how. Insurance will cover the damage. It's not as influential as a lot of people think, but 30% said it was very important. So the X's show where actually there was a statistical relationship between saying it was very important and being more likely to do more vegetation management. So it shows you that thinking it was effective was really critical to doing more. Thinking the risk was really high was critical to doing more. And then knowing how was more important in Montana. That was a more rural area, more complicated landscapes where they were probably going to be doing it themselves. Both Ventura and Alachua County were probably going to be hiring contractors, which is why cost becomes more important in Alachua County. That was a poorer area. And time, for one. So there's variety in the influences and locations. So then we also asked people, to what extent have you made your house more fire resistant? Okay, here it's a little lower overall, but it's still almost 80% have done something or a great deal. We haven't talked as much about changing your house as vegetation management until about the last 8 years. I can show you brochures from the 1970s that have the exact same defensible space grid that you've probably seen in your brochures today. But the information about making your house more fire resistant is more recent. And their effectiveness doesn't come out as critical in two places. And I think part of this is the fact that we actually have not done a good job of explaining how it's effective. So does anybody know the most likely cause of your house burning down from a wildfire? Sparks?
Gutters?
Embers, yeah, it's embers. So do you know why you would want to put screens? So that's why you'd want to put screens on your vents. And you're clearly a plant, so you can't answer.
You identified it well.
So if I said you needed to put screens on the vents and your eaves, does that make sense to you? Yeah, because that keeps that's actually how a lot of houses, when they say the house exploded, it didn't. The embers went in through the vents, were sitting up in the attic for an hour or two, smoldering. And then, so it's actually had been on fire probably for a little while. But we haven't really talked about that dynamic in terms of those things. So understanding how making your home fire resistant, the roof was mentioned, and I think that's a little more obvious to people. It's a big, huge space. It makes sense. You can imagine the embers landing on it, and that's a risk. But some of the other dynamics of how houses are lost are not as obvious, and we could do a better job of explaining that to people. Cost becomes more important to put people in two places. knowing how physical ability in Montana, again, where they were more likely to probably do those changes themselves. The other thing that's useful to notice is they may also be giving lower answers to that question, because if you look in the very left-hand column, most of those existed when purchased for a number of those things. So when we asked, have you done this? They may have interpreted, I didn't do it. So they said no. The other thing to notice is that in general, half of the reasons actions were done for fire and half of them were done for reasons other than fire. In the Midwest, people have great defensible space because of concern about wind blowdown. They're not really worried about fire, but they have great defensible space, but because they're concerned about wind. And this is where I was talking about effectiveness in our literature. So exterior walls, 30% say they don't plan to do it. That makes sense. That's actually that can be very expensive to do. But boxing your eaves and enclosing the underside of your decks, that doesn't have to be very expensive, and that can make a big difference. Think about if you have a wood deck, your ember gets in, settles in all those leaves you have underneath your deck. If you enclose it, that's not going to happen. Other factors, vegetation disposal, competing complementary values. Sometimes people might want to do something, but there's a legal reason they can't. My favorite example is from Lake Tahoe, which there's a lot of effort to maintain the water quality in Tahoe, so they're very concerned about erosion. So the Lake Tahoe Management Authority required people to maintain at least 6 inches of pine needles around their home. The fire department required them to have only 2 inches. So when they had a new house and they were trying to get signed off, they would say, okay, here comes the fire department. They'd rake up all their pine needles, stick them in bags, stick them in their garage, get signed off. And then the Tahoe Management Authority would come out and they'd dump out all their pine needles and get signed off. So they were dealing with competing values where they had trying to meet a requirement. They have since negotiated 3 inches. So, but that's sometimes people, we're trying to balance a whole bunch of values and sometimes even legal reasons that we're trying to adjust. Social norms, the community might think it's a bad idea. A lot of communities actually over time, having good defensible space is the social norm. And there's evidence that people are okay with regulations. If the fire risk is high, my neighbor's risk influences my risk, so where houses are closer together, and where government is seen as having a public safety role. So more incorporated towns, that type of thing. So this is the way to think about defensible space. Again, we start out thinking the problem is just an information deficit thing. They just need information. If they get the information about the risk, they're going to do something. Recognizing the risk says, let's think about maybe doing something. What's the level of risk? How tolerant am I of the issue? What does my experience tell me? What do my social norms tell me I should be doing? Where am I getting my information? Do I trust the people giving me the information? What are the options I have? Okay, all of those add up to be, well, maybe I should do something. That still doesn't lead to deciding to do something. Maybe I'll do something. Then there's a trade-off analysis. Okay, is this going to be effective enough for me to invest my time and money in doing it? Do I have the time and money? How am I going to get rid of that vegetation? Are there other benefits to it? Oh yay, not only does a metal roof solve my fire problem, it solves my snow problem, it solves my hail problem, it's worth it. Are there competing issues that I have to contend with? Adjacent property. That can make people, if you have a property that's adjacent doing nothing, that can make some people really proactive and other people say there's no point. So if all of those add up to be a plus, they will act. If they do not add up to be a plus, then they will not act. And I think I'm going to skip this because this is more messaging. This is for helping managers figure out how to talk to you. And the main message is you need to understand your audience, that you have multiple audiences who care about many different things. You need to understand what they care about and what they already know, and address those issues and address resource limitations. And we too often think about, if we just give people information, that the problem is an information deficit. That's been discounted since the 1950s. That very rarely is the information deficit the issue. And providing information doesn't change behavior. It does increase awareness. Increased awareness does not change behavior. Mass media, it can work for a very simple behavior change. That's why Smokey was actually really effective, because all he said is don't go out and start a fire. That's pretty simple. More complex messages and behavior change, it's not going to do the trick. And as I said earlier, behavior change, interactive communication, talking with people, really the way to go. Use all the reasons, use all the sources. I imagine you guys all turn to different information sources for where you go. And sort of to summarize, for managers, I always ask them to assess their notion of the imagined public, that you may have an idea about why the public thinks, but you need to go out and talk to them and ask them questions and listen to what they say and verify that that notion is accurate. Interactions in social networks can help. That communication, constant, transparent. Knowing, planning, thinking behind decisions is important. I haven't really talked about that, but that's one of the things the research shows, is that there's a lot of acceptance for fire management, provided people understand the amount of planning and thought that goes into them. And that's the thing I always think when I'm out on a prescribed burn or when I'm talking to incident commanders, and I see the amount of planning and thought and knowledge that goes into every single decision that is made on a fire or on a prescribed burn or for any management activity. And I'm always kind of like, if people just understood the amount of thought that goes into it, and from the research we've done, we've seen really good evidence that as people understand the amount of thought and planning that goes into activities, in general, people support most practices. And the advice I like to give, this is what I hear from you folks, so tell me if this does not match your idea. Please tell us who you are, what you do, and why you're doing it. Thank you for the work you do. This comes out of some focus groups I did where we asked people to provide advice. Thank you for asking us what we think. We actually really care a great deal about this landscape. We just don't necessarily have time to come tell you what we think. So we appreciate the fact you asked. Please make your decisions based on science. Please listen to local views, not just us, but your agency staff, because they know our area, they know what we care about. And if you ever feel inspired to read scientific research, Tree Search is actually a really great site. It's where you can download any study funded by the research branch of the Forest Service. And you can download any document, any study for free. And it's a pretty good site. You can search, you can put in a term if you know an author, if you want to care about soils, and it'll pull up everything that's ever been published for the past 30 years, I think. So good site to know about if you ever feel inspired to go track down some research. That's it.
We have time for questions. I hope we have some really good questions. I'll get us started off. I would love to ask the question of, everything's about people want things to be effective, but in science, we don't always know exactly what the outcome is going to be, but they won't support science unless they know it's for sure going to be effective. So
So it doesn't actually have to be for sure effective. It's more just having a sense for what do we know about how effective it is. And I can only speak to what we know in response to how people respond to mitigating and making adjustments to a natural hazard such as fire. And there the evidence is like, is this effectively going to reduce my risk? So people don't say, if you change your house, so the single thing you can do, I think it reduces your risk by like 70% if you just have a fire resistant roof. That's pretty good. Most people are going to change their roof when they get the $20,000 and it's time to change the roof. But if they also understand that putting a screen prevents embers from coming in and that reduces my risk by 10%, that can be enough. So it's not a clear cut, it has to be 100% guarantee. It's just some sense of how effective will this actually be given the investment that we're going to make.
Okay, so speak clearly, talk loud. Hi, so my name's Jim Janong. I'm a local fuel specialist, and I also work on the Rocky Mountain Type 1 team, incident management team. And my question is for you is how have you seen, is there any correlation between the fact that, if folks are folks aware that when mitigation work is done around their house, that firefighters are going to be more inclined to engage on their property? Have you done anything, looked into that kind of?
That's tricky.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. The argument is people will be more likely to mitigate if they think the firefighter's more likely to protect
because we're
their home.
becoming, as an agency, as a culture, we're stepping back more. Fire's going to come. We're going to let it do what it does, unless we have an opportunity. If there's an opportunity, we're going to take that opportunity. But if we don't see an opportunity to do some work, if somebody hasn't mitigated, or if there's a whole subdivision that hasn't mitigated, we're going to let it go, because we're not going to risk, firefighter safety over property. And I'm wondering if folks are starting to see, or if they understand that that's becoming more of our kind of mission.
There's a lot of points to that question. No, it's all right. I mean, it's a big question that needs to be asked, and we need to be thinking about it.
I'm not seeing it, sometimes I see it, I'll see signs on a house that say, my house is savable, and you get in there, nobody's
the hard part about giving an answer is that's a very tricky question along the lines of how I said, experience doesn't inherently lead to people changing their behavior for the good or the bad. It can go both ways. It can be the same thing in that respect for protecting a house. In general, what I have seen is, I think I've only met one person who didn't say, a firefighter should not risk their life to protect my house. I think I've only met one person who said, a firefighter should risk their life to protect my house. Most people say no, that no firefighter should die for my choice to live out in the woods. No. Do they have a sense that if they've mitigated, that increases their chances of a firefighter being there? Some do, some don't care. They just care that it increases the chance their house will survive whether or not there is a firefighter there. It's a plus if a firefighter's there, but a lot of people don't count on it. So there are places where people sort of expect fire protection, but in those places I've seen it's usually very close to a town where there's an incorporated fire department, and or the fire chief has told them to expect protection. In most places, in a lot of places, particularly California, people are like, oh, come on, there's no resources to have an engine at every house. We're not going to have a firefighter at our house. We don't expect that. So it's a complicated answer to that question. And then I think
if our message would be better served if we got that message out more.
I am a big proponent that the Forest Service in particular needs to be much more comfortable with being straightforward about what it can and can't do. That we are more hesitant about doing that than we need to be. Because I think, as I said, when people understand, people can calculate that there's only 5 engines in our neighborhood and 500 houses, that you can't have an engine on our doorstep. So, and in terms of the notion of sort of like that we can't fight every fire, I think that's, again, a point where we need to do a better job about explaining the dynamics of fires and what we can do and what we can't do and that sort of thing. The fire world is very much of a can-do world. It's very hard for firefighters to admit that they can't do something. And so I think we could do a better job of probably being able to admit that. So I don't know if that really answers the whole thing. The other point I will make is one of the tricky questions is that we haven't done enough research on because it's tricky, is if you ask people who should protect a home from fire, it's about 50% say it's my responsibility, 25% say it's my responsibility and the fire department's, and maybe 10% or so say it's entirely the fire department's responsibility. Now, the tricky part is, what do you mean by protect my home? So a lot of those homeowners may, when you actually ask them what they mean, a lot of them say, we'll be referring to mitigation. So it's my job to protect my home by mitigating it before there's ever a fire. When there is a fire, what should be getting done? That's another question. And so it's a really complicated question to try to tease out how people react. I think the other point I would make is, the dynamics of knowledge, understanding, and interactive communication become even more important during a fire. Because during a fire, what you have is heightened uncertainty. And heightened uncertainty, humans hate that. We don't like uncertainty. We'll do everything in the world we can to try to minimize that uncertainty. And so then more knowledge, trust in the information source, transparency, those in that interactive exchange become even more important because they're the ways that you mitigate your uncertainty by having a more certainty of exactly what's happening, exactly when it's happening, and exactly how it's going to affect me and what I need to do and how soon. So I think that's kind of one of the other dynamics that gets shifted in is uncertainty increases during an event, which heightens all of the dynamics that I've talked about.
All right. Well,
Wait, I have a question for you
you have
guys.
a question.
Sorry. So I'm just curious because, you know, this is a presentation I give more to managers. I know how they respond to it. And I'm curious what you heard. Were the things you heard that really resonated, or were there things you heard that were kind of like...
And Sarah, let's have people raise their hand if they are a manager so you know who's in the crowd. Because
right.
I know who's in the crowd, but you don't.
All right.
So if you're affiliated with fire management in any way, shape, or form, raise your hand.
Yeah, I figured it was all the back.
And some others. And some others scattered in the middle here. Okay, anyway. Just to help you know who you're talking to.
That's fair.
So back to your
So
question.
I see a comment over here.
Well, years ago, there was a massive... Years ago, there was a massive fire in Arizona that destroyed a lot of homes. But at the end of that, I was, watching the news about it, and these people had they built this beautiful, beautiful home, and he insisted that the trees be at a distance. I mean, this was a big property. They survived it. That home survived because they did do that mitigation. So if you have a lot of land, you do that. But if you live in a neighborhood and you're 20 feet away from your neighbors, does that need to be a neighborhood project that you do?
Yeah, I mean, it gets much trickier when the houses are close together. And that's exactly the situation where, when some people say regulation is a good idea because I want the fire department to be able to make my neighbor do what they should do. But it can also be in a lot of places they don't want that. And then it is a neighborhood thing. And I've seen some neighborhoods that have done phenomenal work together. Sometimes it's the fire department can be the motivator. Sometimes it's just one woman who I know one neighborhood, she was just bound and determined she was going to give cookies and bake and whatever she needed to do to make sure her neighborhood was safe. And in others, it's the homeowners association that can actually can be very proactive and make things happen. But yes, as soon as the houses start getting close enough that you really affect your neighbor's risk, then you do kind of start needing to have some sort of that coordination. But I will say that you can still do, even if your neighbor doesn't do something, you can do a huge amount that improves your house's safety, whether or not they've done something.
Where do you get that information?
Go talk to one of those people in the back. Or your fire department. Ah, excellent. Where's your fire department? Raise your hand.
Not me, not me.
Him.
I'm from Los Angeles, and while there I worked extensively with the CERT organization, Community Emergency Response Team.
Mm-hmm.
We were a program under the fire department, and our mission there had much to do with earthquake, which they anticipate the big one to be a 7.8 magnitude, and that's more or less what they're preparing for. But I tried to adapt your presentation to my thinking from that involvement. They estimate that there will be 1,700 simultaneous fires out of control in Los Angeles. 1,700. And there will be whole segments of the city that will just be written off because of fire. So, sure, this is forest, but is it, and I think the answer is yes, is it very applicable to the highly congested urban situation of Southern California?
So did everybody hear that sort of? Okay. So there's two things. One is that one of the tricky things about what we talk about with wildfires is that there is a distinction between a structural fire and a wildland fire. And the behavior and how you fight them are actually very different. That's why you see wildland firefighters in really lightweight Nomex with Pulaskis, because that's what you need to be able to do if you're going to hike 20 miles. If you went in with full turnout gear, which weighs, I think, 60 pounds, something like that, to survive inside a home with everything you need for 20 minutes, it doesn't work. So part of the challenge is that once you get into a house-to-house, then your dynamics have changed, and how you have to deal with the fire is going to be very different. So there is sort of a bit of a challenge in applying some of the wildland information to structural, and that's also part of the challenge of the whole story, is that we can talk about wildland fire, but once it gets into a neighborhood that's denser, it actually becomes a very different fire that needs to be fought very differently. And where you might actually have to write off houses simply because they are catching on fire so quickly. But the CERT programs in California are fabulous, and they have been established for earthquakes, but a lot of them are getting used for fire in really great ways. So, and I think...
You know the house fire?
The house...
Station fire.
The station fire, yes.
I worked that.
Oh, did you? That would have been an interesting one to work. Very interesting.
When you get into a conflagration like you're talking about, what you would do is kind of like what they did in the Waldo Canyon fire. It's a rare situation that you'll have ladder trucks in an area like that. But what they did is they just put a lot of water, and in between structures, you're trying to defend the structure next to it. You can write off the one that is burning. You're trying to protect the structure next to it. And you do that even like in downtown Carbondale here. You could have a structure fire, no wildland fire, but if you've got homes close together, you're going to have an engine company just responsible for protecting the house that's next to that. They're not worrying about the house that's burning. So that's one of the tactics you set up there on a structural type situation. You get into a conflagration, it's like the Oakland Hills fire, where home to home, or right close to home, we had the Battlement Mesa fire. That was a conflagration. 9 homes burned, basically from convective and radiation heat and embers from one home going to the next home. And like our presenter mentioned, in a wildfire, there's not enough people to do. In a structure fire, you can bring the army in. You can surround, drown, you can do a lot of things. You can put all your resources. But in a wildfire, since it's spreading all over, you don't have that luxury. So.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the other interesting dynamics with wildland fire, and I know they also did this on the Waldo, is when the flame front came through, they pulled out. But as soon as it had gone through, the engines were back in within like 5 minutes. And so they actually feel like the Waldo Canyon fire is a success story, because they could have lost a lot more houses if they actually hadn't worked a lot with the community, had them be proactive, and hadn't had a plan in place by which they got the engines in as soon as the flame front went in, because they put out a lot of houses where like I had the fortune, I went in after with a team that was assessing damage, and there were quite a number of houses where the ember had caught the roof on fire, and the engine got there in time to get that out. And that has the benefit of both the homeowner doesn't lose their home, but it also prevents that house catching on fire, which once one house catches on fire, that's the source of your fire. I mean, with all the chemicals and all the fuel that's in a house, that's the source for the next fire. So if you can stop one house, you're really stopping a whole bunch. And they did a really fabulous job of stopping the loss from having a lot more houses lost, because they got a lot of embers out afterwards.
So thanks, Sarah, for coming. And if any of you have further questions, please stick around and ask, and we'll see you.
Love is a burning thing, and it makes a fiery ring. Bound by wild desire, I fell into a ring of fire. I fell into a burning ring of fire. I went down, 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 and the flames went higher. And it burns, 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 the ring of fire.